people. I finished a book. Volume 6. This is the last one. It wasn't the best. You know, there was points in this book where I was really enjoying it and just devouring pages. But there was, you know, long stretches, 100-page stretches, where I could hardly, you know, it was all I could do to read 6 pages at a time. The last 100 pages or so were pretty bad. You know, Constantinople falls, and I've still got 150 pages to go in this book. I'm not sure why he did that. Like the last 150 pages was just a bunch of bullshit about different popes of Rome, and he actually tried something very interesting in maybe the last 30 pages, where he talked about the city itself, and you know, who was to blame for the disappearance of statues and the ruin of monuments and shit like that. And basically Gibbon blames that on the Romans themselves, because they would, you know, they would need to build something, and fuck, they'd go over to the pile of ruins and they'd get their stones from there. The middle of it was the Turks. I thought he could have devoted a lot more time to the Turks. And, you know, he talks about the Hungarians and Skanderbeg, and you know, at that time he had an opportunity to talk about Vlad Tepes, I think it's Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, but he was unaware of Vlad, or he chose not to include Vlad. Maybe Vlad wasn't all that important to begin with. I've only ever read, you know, I read quite a bit about the Turks. You know, the Turks would go off every year and fucking invade Europe. And it's really only in one book that they talked about Vlad a little bit. And even then, only for about 50 pages. Not that it wasn't interesting, because it was. I've got a few notes in here. I start out, you know, really gung-ho about finishing the book, but finishing it, this one was 654 pages, and I added them all up, the 6 volumes, and it's over 3,000 pages. So when I got close to finishing it, it was a little bit bittersweet, because I know what I got with Gibbon. You know, I'll pick out a book at the used bookstore and get into it 50 pages and discover that it's shit, and I can go back to Gibbon. And now I can't go back to Gibbon. I don't have no more Gibbon. I don't know what else he's wrote. Actually, I Googled it, and he hasn't wrote a whole hell of a lot else that looks like it would be interesting to me. First note, page 31, the Crusades. He covers the Crusades. He jumps back and forth. Nowadays, if you get a modern book on the Crusades, there's a lot of course, a lot of emphasis on Saladin, and a lot of emphasis on the Battle of Hattin, the Horns of Hattin. They don't even call it Hattin. They called it something else. Now I can't remember what it was. He spends a few pages questioning the motives of the Crusaders, and I really agree with him. So I have to read from. Now I can't remember what page it was on, but this was good, and I want to find it, so you'll have to bear with me. here it is. And he's discussing, they're making their way, you know. Some of them went across the sea, you know. The Venetians had a navy. They would charge you something to transport your troops, but most of them just marched. They had to go through Hungary. They had to go by Constantinople, to the detriment of Constantinople, because they did sack it once. So this is about a typical march. This is in the very beginning. The first Crusades were not organized. They were just fucking peasants that went to get slaughtered. Their rear was again pressed by a herd of 200,000, the most stupid and savage refuse of the people, who mingled with their devotion a brutal license of rapine and drunkenness. Some counts and gentlemen, at the head of 8,000 or 3,000 horse, attended the motions of this multitude to partake in the spoil. But their genuine leaders, and then in parentheses it says, may we credit such folly, were a goose and a goat, who were carried in the front, and to whom these worthy Christians ascribed an infusion of the divine spirit. Of these and of other bands of enthusiasts, the first and most easy warfare was against the Jews, the murderers of the Son of God. In the trading cities of the Moselle and the Rhine, their colonies were numerous and rich, and they enjoyed, under the protection of the emperor and the bishops, the free exercise of their religion. At Verdun, Treves, Metz, Spires, and Worms, many thousands of that unhappy people were pillaged and massacred. Nor had they felt a more bloody stroke since the persecution of Hadrian. So yeah, I had seen that before too. And I guess, you know, the bishops were happy. They would say, "Oh, good job, you know, you did your crusade." I made a note here about it. Gibbon bounces around a bit with the history of the Crusades, and the Battle of Hattin is called the Battle of Tiberia, which I'm assuming is a city named after Tiberius. The Crusades probably don't get as much attention as they should. Maybe that's why he, you know, only goes a couple pages in Hattin. Really, he pays a lot more attention to what goes on when they're near Constantinople. A massacre of European Christians by the city's Christians sets off. Yeah, they do. They sack Constantinople, and the Crusaders are pissed off because they think that the emperor there is not supplying with enough food, and they have all kinds of reasons. And of course, there's schisms. You know, there's differences in how they celebrate their religion. And this, I'm supposed to read something here. The priests and the monks. The priests and monks were the loudest and most active in the destruction of the schismatics, and they chanted a thanksgiving to the Lord when the head of a Roman cardinal, the Pope's legate, was severed from his body, fastened to the tail of a dog, and dragged with savage mockery through the city. Can you imagine, that? Some guy's head tied to the tail of a dog. Must have been a pretty big dog. I think a little dog, cat probably couldn't. Cat would not have dragged it around. Cat would have just sat there and said, "Get the fucking head off my tail." Halfway through the final volume, yes. Yeah, we're getting close to the end of Constantinople, and it's the first mention of gunpowder. Later on, they attribute gunpowder to being invented in Germany, but it was not. We all know that the Chinese did it. And we're on the Mongols here now, so which was pretty interesting. The Mongols and Tamerlane. That was a pretty interesting part of the book. I zipped through that shit. The Mongols would have attacked Japan, but apparently there were some pretty fierce storms. And the Mongols weren't really a seafaring nation. They tried twice to invade Japan, and each time they were wrecked. Read the second paragraph up to the human species. Okay. The Latin world was darkened by this cloud of savage hostility. A Russian fugitive carried the alarm to Sweden, and the remote nations of the Baltic and the ocean trembled at the approach of the Tartars, whom their fear and ignorance were inclined to separate from the human species. Yeah, Gibbon didn't go into it too much, but there's even pictures drawn of once it got started that the Mongols and the Tartars and the Magyars and all these people, once it got started that they had the heads of dogs, that rumor swept around Europe, and people would swear that they saw these dogmen. And it didn't help that these people did shit like scarification, and they even used pieces of wood and straps to kind of change the shape of their skulls. If you ever see these skulls on these stupid videos on YouTube where it's a big elongated skull and somebody is claiming it's an alien skull, that's a Hunnic skull. It's from a Hunnic burial. Go an awful long ways on any notes here. Top of page 4. Oh, okay, that was another. To maintain the harmony of authority and obedience, to chastise the proud, to protect the weak. Here they're talking about the duties of I can't think of what they call him. Well, it would be the monarch of the Turkish people. I'm not sure who he's talking about here. Maybe Mehmet II. I don't know. But they're talking about, how well he did his duties. How good of a monarch was he? And this is what he was supposed to do. And as I read this, compare this to what we have now. To maintain the harmony of authority and obedience, to chastise the proud, to protect the weak, to reward the deserving, to banish vice and idleness from his dominions, to secure the traveler and merchant, to restrain the depredations of the soldier, to cherish the labors of the husbandman. The husbandman is a farmer. To encourage industry and learning, and, by an equal and moderate assessment, to increase the revenue without increasing the taxes, are indeed the duties of a prince. And then I'm supposed to go to 417, and I knew this was going to be hard to do. Find 417. Because the pages are so small, so thin. Oh, these are the things towards the end. The Emperor of Constantinople, he knows what's coming. He knows that the Turks are going to batter down his walls, and so he goes to Rome to try to get some support, get some help, get some boats, get some people, some weapons, and instead he gets involved in a schismatic argument. And this is what they argue about: the use of unleavened bread in the communion of Christ's body, the nature of purgatory, the supremacy of the Pope, and the single or double procession of the Holy Ghost. And of course, anybody that knows anything about me knows how ridiculous I think all of those things are. Last page. I liked what he wrote here on the very last page, and then I thought, I almost didn't read the next page, but it was written by Gibbon. So, it was among the ruins of the capital that I first conceived the idea of a work which has amused and exercised near 20 years of my life, and which, however inadequate to my own wishes, I finally delivered to the curiosity and candor of the public. And I'm going to read, I know this video is getting kind of long, but I'm going to read this. It's about half a page here. I have presumed to mark the moment of conception. I shall now commemorate the hour of my final deliverance. It was on the day, or rather night, of the 27th of June, 1787, between the hours of 11 and 12, that I wrote the last lines of the last page in a summer house in my garden. After laying down my pen, I took several turns in a bercio, or covered walk, of acacias, which commands a prospect of the country, the lake, and the mountains. The air was temperate, the sky was serene, the silver orb of the moon was reflected from the waters, and all nature was silent. I will not dissemble the first emotions of joy on the recovery of my freedom, and perhaps the establishment of my fame. But my pride was soon humbled, and a sober melancholy was spread over my mind by the idea that I had taken an everlasting leave of an old and agreeable companion, and that whatsoever might be the future fate of my history, the life of the historian must be short and precarious. It's kind of sad. I don't know. Gibbon, he didn't live long. He died kind of a horrible death. Maybe he knew he was sick at that time. I don't know. He was a pretty amazing guy, and much like him, I'm saying goodbye to an old buddy here, even though it didn't take me 20 years. It took me just less than a year to read all 6 volumes. It sounds like a long time, but I read over 40 other books too. Thank you.